This is every type of meta ads campaign that you need to be aware of when you're running ads for e-commerce. Getting straight into it, we have ABO. This is one of my favorite campaign types because it is one of the most stable and controllable campaign types. It gives you the most stability as you scale. It also gives you the most deterministic data, which is it gives you the most steady and stable data on exactly which creatives are working and which ones aren't. Here's what an ABO truly is. If you think about campaigns as a folder system, so you have your campaign. Within your campaign, you will have ad sets. We'll call these ad sets. And then within these ad sets, you'll have your creative. And you'll have multiple creatives per ad set. Now, what ABO means is ad set budget optimization, which means that your budget will be determined at the ad set level. Now, why is this important and how is it different to the other campaign types like CBO? Well, in ABOs, each of your budgets are set at the ad set level, and Meta will absolutely spend this entire budget on this specific ad set for these creatives. And the main benefit that you get, the main pro you get, is that when you're testing many batches of creatives like this, and let's say you have even 10 of these ad sets going at the same time, you're able to get a apples to apples comparison on how each of them are performing. And on top of that, you're going to get clean data on exactly which ad sets are performing better, which batches of creative are performing better, and therefore you'll be able to inform your creative testing cycle much better. The difference between running an ABO creative testing and a CBO creative testing is that ABO allows you to get that definitive data to then also will allow you to get that definitive data even if there are other ad sets with winning creatives inside them. This way, you get much more stability, you can control exactly where your budget goes, and it gives you the cleanest signal when it comes to your creative testing. But then what are the cons to ABO? Well, we've listed out the pros, which is it gives you a clean signal and allows you to control your spend on certain creatives. The cons are that Meta can't actually dynamically allocate your budget. Let's say there's 2 ad sets in one campaign. Well, this total campaign will then spend $200 a day. And the issue is that Meta has to spend $100 on this ad set, and it also has to spend $100 on this ad set here, even if this one is not a winner and this one is a winner. So theoretically, you're losing out on extra performance because you didn't let Meta spend more on this winning campaign, unless you're staying on top of it and dynamically allocating the budget in yourself. That's the biggest con with ABO. You're losing a percentage of your efficiency in exchange for more control and cleaner data. Now, that all being said, what are the circumstances that you typically use ABO? Well, number one, creative testing. Many brands will use ABO for creative testing for the reason I mentioned earlier, which is you will actually be able to warm up your ad creative and make sure that it actually spends, and then get a clear definitive signal on how well it's performing, benchmarked against all of your other ad sets and all of your other creative batches. The second reason to use ABO, and this is getting a little bit more complicated, but Meta doesn't always spend on the right creative, and it's not Meta's fault, it's actually the way the platform is built and what it optimizes towards. And to understand that, you have to understand attribution, which we'll get into in another video. However, for now, you just have to understand that most meta ad accounts optimizing for 1-day view, plus 1-day engagement, plus 7-day click. And the problem is, if you have a high ticket product, well, Meta's not always going to know that someone bought a month later, and they might actually misattribute this or lose that signal completely. So if you have a product that you know takes 30, 60, 90 days to convert, however, your ads are set to 7-day click as the longest window, well, you're not always gonna tell Meta to spend on the right ads because you're setting up the signal to go for more short-term ad creative conversions. And because of that, Meta may not spend on the right creative. So in those situations, when you have long conversion lag, so if you have conversion lag and you have a purchase that takes longer than your typical purchase conversion cycle, it is good to make sure that you actually allocate the right budget to the right ad set and the right ads so that you continue to drive performance. Otherwise, if you leave Meta to decide, it's likely going to decide on whatever falls into this window, which may not be the actual right creative. The third reason is for other reasons. You may just need to control spend Because while Meta may be able to allocate your budget to the right ad set, it may be doing it again based on this KPI and this signal and this attribution setting. And what that's going to do is not always bid on the exact type of customer that you want. And that is because some creatives make it very easy for Meta to get a attributed conversion. Whereas for other creatives, they may be doing more than just getting a one-day view or one-day engaged view conversion. They might also be building a brand over the long term, and they might also be creative formats that you actually naturally want to spend more in because they build your top of funnel, which I'll get into in a bit as well. But because of those reasons, you may just want to control that spend. And if that's the case, ABO is a great way to go. Now, let's talk about CBO, or campaign budget optimization. Simply put, campaign budget optimization is where you let Meta decide exactly where to spend your budget. So again, we have the example of a campaign and we have the ad sets. And you would now set the budget at the campaign level, meaning that instead of setting 100, 100, 100 here, you would set a $300 a day budget and allow Meta to decide which ad sets it wants to spend on. And this is typically used for, I'll just map out the actual creatives within these ad sets. This is typically used for scaling campaigns for e-commerce. And the reason for that is you graduate your winners to a CBO campaign and you're letting Meta dynamically decide which creatives are going to drive you the best result. The reason people do this is because typically the percentage return you get on a CBO is the highest possible version in a Meta ads account. However, there are a few downfalls that you have to be aware of. And one of them is Meta isn't always going to spend on the right ad set within this type of campaign. So more than ever, when you're running CBOs, you actually have to monitor which ads are spending and which ad sets are spending. Because what can happen is you could have so many different ad sets with so many different batches of ads, or you have one ad set with many different ads in it, and it starts concentrating the spend on just a core few of these ads. And the issue here is that Meta may be informing this spend based on, again, this one-day view, one-day engaged view, and 7-day click attribution. So what it's trying to do is trying to optimize either for maximum value or maximum volume of conversions that fall within this window. And the problem with that is you might have some ads that are a percentage discount. So it could be a 50% off ad. However, long-term, putting all of your spend behind a 50% off ad will not build your brand. It's just getting as many conversions at the highest volume or highest value in today. And the problem with this, when all of your budget is here, let's say $280 of that $300 is in something like a static discount, all of your spend being concentrated here gives you a false signal and it drains your entire funnel while temporarily increasing performance because it's going to empty it out in a short period of time. And the reason it's doing that is because while you're getting so many conversions on this type of static creative, Meta's really counting the ones in here, and it's not counting what happens after 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days. So how do you combat this? Well, there's a few ways. The first one, and my favorite, is to set minimum spends and to segment out the creative manually. So you can have multiple ad sets within your scaling CBO, separated by the type of content, or simply separated out by discount and non-discount messaging. There's many ways to segment your creative, but setting minimum spend. So you could say minimum $50 spend, and this is going to allow this ad set to spend minimum $50. You can set a minimum here as well of $100, and maybe this is top of funnel creative, which means that Meta has to spend $100 minimum top of funnel here, and it's going to allow that entire funnel to consistently being built while you're still allowing Meta to spend on this creative as well. Now, here are some of the areas to use this in. Number one, and the most common, is scaling. When you're scaling larger budgets, especially in regions like the US, this is one of the best campaign types to use because it allows Meta to actually learn and to actually spend across your entire portfolio of creative. Number two, some people will run their creative testing within CBOs as well. And this works for a portion of brands where the spend concentration isn't as big of an issue. When you're doing creative testing, the best thing to do is to make sure that you're actually running these minimum spends. The third reason is when you're scaling with cost caps or bid caps. And that's because when you scale with cost caps and bid caps and you set the caps at all of the ad set levels, you're allowing Meta to dynamically pick which ad sets and batches of creative are actually going to go the distance and therefore spend this daily budget, which you would typically inflate. Again, some of the cons of this is that it won't always spend on the right creative. It may overspend on lower funnel objectives, and sometimes it just concentrates all of your spend on a very small percentage of your creatives, even though there are other winners in the account. Meta themselves will say to actually warm up is the specific terminology used, the creative in an ABO testing campaign, so it stands an actual chance to scale within your CBOs. And that is CBOs. Next up, we have traffic and engagement campaigns. These are ideally not run for e-commerce. And the reason is you're asking Meta for the wrong incentive. You're asking it to send as many clicks as possible or as many eyeballs on a creative. And the problem is clicks and eyeballs do not equal sales. Now, some people will argue with me and say that it is for incrementality once you hit a certain level of spend. Well, I personally disagree, and I actually would run higher funnel objectives. For example, add to cart, landing page views, but ideally 50% scroll, so they're not bounced views, or initiate checkout, or even add to carts with a quiz funnel attached. To properly measure this though, you should be using an incrementality tool, something like a Northbeam, to understand, are these actually driving net new reach to expand that ceiling on your already maxed out e-commerce advertising inventory? Or are they just bringing in junk traffic that's polluting your pixel? One of the biggest dangers of running clicks, eyeballs, through plays, whatever it is for a traffic or engagement campaign is that it actually pollutes your pixel. And one of the biggest ideas and concepts that you need to be aware of in meta ads in 2026 and into the future is the idea of signals. Meta is not a deterministic system. It is signal-oriented and probabilistic, which means it's taking all these various inputs and formulating an idea of what type of customers that you want. If a lot of this type of traffic is hitting your website, it's going to try retargeting that traffic. It's going to build a profile of poor quality traffic to retarget everything else against, which is not what you want when you're trying to scale new customer acquisition properly. So instead of running traffic campaigns, link clicks, and any of these reach type campaigns, instead run something more incremental. And before that, ideally, actually just run sales and max out your purchase objective campaigns first for that highest quality traffic. Within purchase campaigns, you can also test incremental attribution. You can test using a different attribution window. You can test stripping out one day view. There's so much that you can do before you start running this type of campaign. And that's traffic and engagement. I won't spend too much more time on this because quite frankly, they're a bit of a waste of time when it comes to scaling eCom. Next up, we have cost caps. The first thing to understand with cost caps is fundamentally how they work. Now, I'm going to say a prediction now, which is more and more of the future of meta advertising will go towards cost caps and bid caps. But for right now, there's still a 50-50 strategy that you should test to see if you can get that extra scalability. Here's how they work, and here's why they don't work for a lot of different brands. Cost caps are where you set an average cost per result goal. And I will highlight the difference with a bid cap. So with a cost cap, you're setting, let's say, a $50 CPA. And I will visualize this as a line, and we'll have a chart here with a Y and X axis. So when you're setting a cost cap at $50, you're telling it that the average conversion should cost you $50. And so you'll have a conversion at 30, you'll have a conversion at 60, you'll have a conversion at 20, you'll have a conversion at 55. And all of these added out together will equal your $50 CPA. And typically, people will set daily budgets of $10,000, $100,000, and even $1 million a day to signal to Meta that, hey, if you can get us this $50 CPA, we will absolutely spend as much as we possibly can. What this leads to is an inflated bid within the auction. So when you have such a large budget, they call them CIBs, cost inflated bid strategy. And the thinking behind this is you're jamming your auction strength right to the baseline of where you're actually happy for a conversion. Here are the things to keep in mind though, because if you think about it, you can set a target CPA or target ROAS. Why wouldn't everyone just run this? Well, the truth is it doesn't work for all brands. And I'm going to dive into the mechanics of why. The first reason why it doesn't work is because some products are fundamentally incompatible with cost cap style campaigns. And the best example of those are actually any products with conversion lag. You see, how does it know that you've got a $50 CPA? Well, again, it relies on your attribution setting. So there's 1-day view plus 1-day engaged view plus 7-day click. Now, running a cost cap campaign on just the default setting is actually, in some instances, not the best thing to do, because your 1-day view attribution is also going to be stuck in there, which means that it's going to take a lot of credit for purchases that would have happened anyway. Now, let's say you've got it set to just 1-day engaged view and 7-day click. Meta can only really claim a purchase and start to spend your budget if that criteria is met. So someone had to click on an ad within the last 7 days, or they had to engage with it with a 1-day window. The problem with that is not all products fall within that time delay. So when you launch this and it actually takes someone 10 days to convert, or it actually takes them 30, 60, or 90 days to convert, they're not going to get picked up by this cost cap. So therefore, if you set your actual cost cap at where it needs to be, it just may not spend. And that is one of the biggest issues with cost caps currently, and one of the failure modes. They either don't spend, or you've set your target CPA too high and they're spending too much. The second reason is because for a lot of products, they're actually not built fundamentally to convert like this either. Because if they have a conversion lag, it's typically because they're high AOV, or they're not a direct response / impulse buy. Cost caps work the best when it's a really convincing direct response purchase. And what I mean by that is someone has to see the ad, want to click on it, and then want to buy within a 7-day window, or even ideally a 1-day window. The shorter that conversion from when they saw the ad to when they make a purchase is, the higher chance you'll actually be able to scale with cost caps. There's another reason why they may work for some brands and not work for others, and that is because of brand equity. A lot of these brands that are scaling on cost caps have other channels, and they're just using Meta to capture that demand instead of using Meta to create that demand or to generate that demand for this particular product. And a really good example of this is any fashion brand or any other type of visual wearable brand where there's actually an army of influencers already promoting this brand on other channels. That is a situation where your top of funnel may already be handled by TikTok or Instagram organic, and now you're just using cost caps to draw in and capture that demand at the lowest cost possible. The third reason is because if you're running cost caps with existing campaigns that are lowest volume and will spend anyway, you have to think about Meta's incentive. Let's say you're running a standard campaign alongside a cost cap campaign. They're both set at $1,000 a day. However, you have one set at a $50 TCPA. So your target per conversion is $50, and you're telling Meta, don't spend the budget on this campaign unless it's hitting this $50 CPA. What we can see typically happening is that this campaign is going to spend anyway. So instead of spending this campaign efficiently, it will spend on this campaign, and then the cost cap becomes a retargeting campaign, which will always hit its $50 target CPA, especially if you have 1-day view enabled on this campaign. And now you're actually spending a higher amount because this campaign is going to spend regardless, and Meta is going to try to attribute or use more of a retargeting audience on this campaign from the demand that was created from your campaign that would spend anyway. So in short, what can happen is that this becomes a version of a campaign that doesn't attribute many sales. However, it's driving a lot of top of funnel. And then this campaign, your cost cap campaign, becomes your bottom of funnel. And the main issue with this is that you may be overpaying for some of these customers. Your CPA in this campaign might get worse, and your overall incrementality may not be as high as you would think. So this artificially inflated budget, or this budget here, could just be getting wasted on existing customers. The way to avoid this is to make sure that you cut out 1-day view, but you also make sure you set exclusions on your cost cap campaign so it's actually hitting new customers. Outside of all of those caveats, cost caps are an amazing way to scale. And if you can crack them for your brand because you've got a lower AOV product that's faster with the direct response purchase, it can be one of the best ways to scale and to maintain margin and contribution margin on your overall e-commerce business. Finally, we have bid caps. The biggest thing about bid caps is people don't understand the difference between a cost cap and a bid cap. So let me draw it out for you right now. Let's say you have 2 campaigns. This is a cost cap, and this is a bid cap. They're both set to $50 as the target cost per result. Target cost per purchase is the most. With a cost cap, it will average your spend over these conversions. So some conversions will be more expensive than $50 and some will be cheaper than $50 to give you a combined average to spend your $1,000 a day. For bid caps will only allow you to spend up until your threshold. They will never spend, well, not never, sometimes they glitch out, but they are designed to not overspend over your actual target threshold. So when you spend $1,000 a day, your CPA should always be your target, under your target of $50. Now, why would you use one over the other? Cost caps are more for driving volume, whereas bid caps are more for cost control and profitability. And this is the main difference between these two campaign types. For your brand, you should actually test the difference between cost caps and bid caps based on what you actually want to optimize for. If you're running out of inventory and you're scaling too fast, using bid caps can be a great way to rein in that spend while maximizing your absolute profit while not completely kneecapping your acquisition. Whereas cost caps are a great way to scale to those massive $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a day spends without actually blowing out your target CPAs on any given days and to ride more of a up and down wave. So this is the biggest key difference between cost caps and bid caps, and the ones you use should depend on what works best for your business. Bid caps you can think of as more restrictive, they're harder to get spend, but when they do work, they're very profitable, and cost caps are the best for scaling into serious volume. So then the question becomes, which campaign type should I use for my e-commerce business? I'm going to show you the rough structure of what an ideal campaign situation should look like for a brand that is aiming to scale and grow whilst controlling costs. The first thing you want is an ABO campaign for creative testing. Next up, as you scale your spend, you want to add in a CBO scaling campaign. And this combination will be enough to get you to $1,000 a day, $2,000 a day of spend. As you continue to grow, you're going to want to split these out. So while you have these campaigns, a lot of people are scared to add in additional ABOs and additional CBOs. The times to add additional campaigns in are when you're targeting a completely different customer, you're targeting a different category, or you're targeting something which is outside your standard scope of business. What I mean by that is you may have an ABO and CBO campaign for a category within your business. For example, you may have this for footwear. But what happens if you start to introduce socks? Sometimes if you introduce a product that's too adjacent into, say, a CBO, it's actually going to derail the type of customer that this entire mini funnel goes towards. So what you would actually typically do, once you've decided that you do want to actually invest and sell socks as a separate line item, is to duplicate this setup over here and have another testing and another scaling campaign. So another ABO and another CBO. Some people will consolidate this, especially if your spend is too low, into just a CBO. However, the overall principle is the least amount of campaigns possible to achieve the actual business objective. For now, I'm going to keep this simple and assume that there's one main category. The other campaigns that you could bolt onto this are incremental attribution. Once you hit a certain level of spend, you want to start testing different campaign types. For example, incremental attribution. This runs on a different campaign type and a different algorithm that is aimed at targeting incrementality. So if you think about it, when you have a smaller brand that's only doing 100K a month, you don't need to worry as much about incrementality because you don't have that many existing customers to begin with. So when you spend more of your spend naturally goes towards new customers. However, if you're doing 2 to 5 million a month, you really need to start looking at incremental attribution and all of the other audience exclusions within your campaigns, because it's likely that as you increase your budgets, you're going to be retargeting this existing cohort of customers much more than the person who's only at 100K a month. So test incremental attribution. The next campaign type is a retargeting campaign. And this is great, especially as your ABOs and CBOs should have some level of audience exclusions to retarget those audiences and to control spend and frequency on those already in your funnel. Other campaign types that you can add to this as your spend gets larger are cost caps and bid caps because this will allow you, especially when you start to implement them in the form of CBOs and ABOs, will allow you to scale to the next level while controlling your costs within the algorithm. However, the thing to make sure of in these situations is that your cost caps are actually incremental. And I don't mean incremental attribution as a campaign setting. What I mean is that your cost caps should actually be driving a net new customer that you can see in Shopify that came from your cost cap, and it should be driving these at a profitable MER. The other thing to note is that it can't be cannibalizing off your existing highest volume or highest value campaigns. Other campaign types that you can also launch are highest value CBOs. These are a great way to maximize the AOV and also run on a different set of algorithms to your lowest volume campaigns. Once you run these stacks, you should be able to, with a setup like this, actually scale to pretty significant revenue and spend numbers, as long as these are segmented out correctly based on the categories that you're selling. Your main categories should have a stack of different campaign types that you're testing, and your subcategories should have just a CBO or just an ABO where you're able to control that spend and sell those products and scale them up. Now, there are also higher funnel objectives, like your lead-based objectives running to your quiz funnels. Once you max this out from a spend perspective, also segmenting them out by country, also eventually running upper funnel objectives like add to carts, but measuring the incrementality of those once you've tapped this out. And when I say tap this out, I mean you've already hit as many people as you can on a purchase objective, and you're wanting to drive more incrementality and more new customers. So instead of trying to jam more budget just into this setup once you're spending 100K per day, as an example, you would actually want to test add to cart and measure the incrementality with a tool that does MTA, MMM, and Geo. And this campaign structure, run on a weekly cadence where you're graduating winners and scaling them in both your ABO and CBO, is one of the best ways to currently structure your brand in 2026. And this structure, plus the bolt-ons, is one of the best ways to scale your brand with meta ads. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be running through all of this more in depth, so subscribe to the channel and I will hit you back next week with more content on how to scale with your paid media.